Thanks so much, Erin. Well, it's great to virtually be here with everyone today. Excited for this discussion. We have a great lineup of panelists for this conversation who each bring a very different perspective to the conversation. Just briefly, by way of introduction of myself, as Erin said, I'm Julia Hamm. I'm CEO of the Smart Electric Power Alliance. We are a nonprofit that works with stakeholders across the electric power sector, working towards getting to a carbon-free energy future by 2050 or sooner. And so really excited for this conversation as we talk about how the evolution of the energy transition is unfolding, the role of customers, customer centricity, just such a dynamic space and so much to cover. So we're going to jump right into it. We've only got 45 minutes. As Erin said, I also will encourage those folks watching to submit questions as you have them. Please don't hold them to the end. I will be monitoring the questions and I will sprinkle them in as it makes sense to do so and make sure we get to as many of them as we can. I'd like to start by having our panelists do very brief self-introductions, again, to make sure you understand the perspective that they're bringing to this conversation. So Blair, let me turn it over to you first.
Well, thank you, Julia, and hello, everybody. I'm Blair Peberdy, Vice President of Government and Corporate Relations at Electra, Inc. It's primarily a distribution utility up in Canada in the greater Niagara, Hamilton, Toronto region. It's a new company. It's formed as a result of a merger of 7 different utilities and we're about 3.5 years into our business now. But the interesting thing about it, to me, when I joined, was that the utility was actually formed largely in response to what is happening in the market with traditional regulated utilities. That is, loads are disappearing. We don't expect them to come back, even with the electrification of transportation. And so these companies decided that scaling up and coming forward with a new business strategy that focuses on new technologies as well as the traditional grid technologies was the way to go. And so that's where we're coming from. And it's been a lot of fun so far on the journey. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Blair. And I should mention that Electra actually was SEPA's 2020 Public Power Utility of the Year. We just announced it about a month ago. So
that's right.
In recognition of all the great work that you and the team are doing there. So great. Well, let me turn next to Cengizhan and hear about the perspective from Engie.
Thank you, Julia, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. My name is Cengizhan YENERIM. I am the head of central portfolio management for Engie North America. Engie, as you may know, is a very giant utility. Our roots go back to the Suez Canal more than a century ago. And we've been a big player both in the United States and Canada and the rest of the world as a big player in the utility industry. Well, what we try to do is our purpose is to lead the zero carbon transition for our communities and our customers. And I'm glad to be a part of this panel. I'm looking forward to speaking about customer centricity. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. David.
Yes, David O'Brien. I'm a director in Guidehouse's energy practice, global energy practice. Many folks probably know of us as Navigant not too long ago. We became Guidehouse just last year. You know, we just love this topic as a company, as a practice. We just love the topic of customers and utilities engaging with customers and leveraging all the technologies that are out there today. I've always been interested in this topic. Going back, I got into this space as a regulator, you know, gosh, almost 20 years ago now. And I've always been interested in how the grid can be more intelligent and more dynamic, especially for customers, which opens up a great discussion I think we can have about how do we make that happen. So I'm looking forward to it.
Great, thanks. Well, let's jump right in. I'd like to start and hear and have a conversation about what are some of the most interesting examples of innovation that you are part of or that you're witnessing in terms of engaging consumers in what's happening in the marketplace? Anyone want to, David, do you want to jump in from the Guidehouse perspective, since you have a perspective
Sure.
across multiple utilities?
Absolutely. So I think that a couple of thoughts. One is, and this is maybe the former regulator bias, but I definitely like things that I see that are what I would describe as process innovation, meaning regulatory processes, states and jurisdictions that are making it possible for utilities to be creative and to bring new customer programs to bear. Some of my favorite examples are in Vermont, where I actually live, and Green Mountain Power is a good example. They have a process where they're allowed to bring new solutions to customers in a very rapid fashion. And so I have my Tesla Powerwall here in my house, and they offer a bundle that, you know, brings together solar, storage, electric vehicle charging, and even grid energy and a subscription price. Another really good example where I've done a lot of work is in Long Island with PSEG Long Island. Their Utility 2.0 program allows them to come up with new ideas, new projects in the customer-facing space and the new grid space each year, and launch them as, you know, sort of rapid prototyping sort of programs for their customers. And some of the more innovative things I've seen there involve everything from, you know, storage and solar and electric vehicle solutions, but also what I think is really important to crack the code with customers is to start to address the buy-side sort of issues with Unbill Financing, which PSEG is rolling out now, is an Unbill Financing mechanism so that people can afford to consider storage, electric vehicles, and so on, heat pumps, if you will. So that's a lot of what we see. And I'd also say, you know, we'll talk about this certainly, but customer acquisition is, you know, oftentimes at the root of this. You know, I think that this panel has a pretty good idea about how to think differently about customer segments and approaching customers.
Yeah, if I might add to that, Julia, I won't, you know, repeat what David said. We're doing a number of those types of things up here. The regulatory regime up here is moving in that direction. It's not, it doesn't sound like it's as far as advanced as it is in Vermont, but understanding that the market is changing and that consumer needs are changing, we are investing in modernizing the grid, because the grid itself needs to be in a place where it can start to accommodate these new technologies and make it a seamless, painless exercise for customers as they start to adapt them. And one thing of interest is we're just getting ready to go out for a large RFP for second generation smart meters. And one of the key things we're looking at there is the ability to, you know, for two-way power flows, so that we can start to facilitate distributed energy technologies in homes and businesses, and make the transaction of power between consumers and the utility easier to do and more seamless. So we expect that it's a very large project that we're doing with a number of other utilities up here. But the second generation smart meters, I think, will open the door to a lot of the things that David mentioned as well.
And Cengiz, you come at this from the perspective of the C&I customers who, you know, so clearly are becoming every day becoming a more and more significant driver of change in this industry. So what are some of the things you're seeing with your C&I customers that you think are really interesting and people should be watching?
Yeah, so I mean, technology and innovation is reshaping the way we navigate life in any number of ways. And of course, as a result of that, the energy economy of the future looks very different than it does today. And I can certainly talk about a lot of different innovations that are happening in our industry, the new maybe capabilities that we're adding under our belt. But it's really very difficult to pick one over the other, because if you're geeky enough, every single one of these are interesting, cool. So in fact, maybe to your question, I'll try to focus on something else also to keep the topic in line with our panel's theme, which is customer centricity. And you can call this an innovation. And this particular innovation I want to talk about is really a technical one. It's a transition in our business model from a or function-centric base to a service-centric base, the as-a-service business model, as a lot of people call it. So it sounds very simple, of course, but it's one where if you don't implement it correctly with the customer actually taking the control, it's also the business model where you'll unfortunately fail miserably. And what's really interesting is that the tech or the capabilities that you have matters a lot less in this business model. That doesn't mean, of course, not capable of delivering a solution. It's such that if you're not able to instill a culture of customer centricity in your organization, the level of success on being able to deliver the capabilities does not really matter too much. And it all starts with how you engage with your customers, getting to know them, understanding what they do, what they care about, so that you can figure out the job done. And trust me, it's very rare that the job to be done is to deliver energy and send a bill. As an organization, our focus is CI, but I think it also applies to the mass markets, the residential sector too. You might be delivering sustainability or zero carbon transition as a service to a Fortune 50 company or a massive public institution, or you might be delivering climate control or lighting to a single household. The underlying interaction with your customer or the intrinsic value is very rarely the kilowatt hours. It's these other things. And understand that and have your whole organization try to use these capabilities instead of selling them to deliver these outcomes that your customer cares about. That to me is the innovation. So maybe I'll conclude with maybe an example, what we have been doing with the Ohio State University. That was our trademark deal we signed, I think, a couple of years ago. And again, the innovation was we just had a different conversation with them. We took the management of their entire energy infrastructure off their hands. We gave them financial and operational flexibility so that they can focus on what they care about, which is not the kilowatt hour, it's academics, it's scientific research, it's affordable education, while of course they're reducing their carbon footprint and associated costs. So I think it was a first of its kind deal in our sector. And it was not because of technology, it was our capability. I mean, it wasn't about our capability to track the crowds or the students using the university's Wi-Fi mesh so that we can detect empty rooms and we can automatically turn off lights and direct air conditioning or anything like that. Yes, that helps, but it's the entire engagement with the customer itself. I think that was the innovation.
That's fantastic, and actually that really builds on going back to David. You mentioned the increasing importance of customer segmentation and sort of going back to thinking about the residential customer in our industry. So much of how we've operated has been focused on really within a class treating all customers the same. And so talk to us about how do you see that needing to evolve as we go forward?
Yeah, no, terrific. And I think you think about this, right? Where else in the world of consumer activity would you divide the market between residential, commercial, and industrial customers? We wouldn't do that. We think about what really motivates these customers. What's their value proposition to what we were just talking about? I love the idea of thinking about it, energy, not just in terms of electrons. What's the service aspect of that? What's the customer experience component of that? And I think, I don't want to be unkind at all to utilities. I think that this is an industry that has had a long history that had a very specific expectation of it. It was really mostly around delivering electricity, maintaining the reliability of the grid. To now go into that customer space and start to talk with customers, not as if they're a given as a customer because you have them by default, but how are you going to engage them in ways that matter to them? And I think, and I'm curious what other people on the panel think about this, I have often thought that a lot of this is just demographics, that the demographics are in our favor in the sense that as you go younger and younger in the customer populations, you've got customers that are more and more keen to being sustainable, to dealing with climate change. Not to be unkind to my fellow 50-somethings, but they might be more much more technology savvy and more apt to use smart home technologies and so on. So I think we need to think about customer populations in a whole different way. What are they motivated by, and to break down those three silos into much more discrete categories, and really think about what motivates them individually as customers, and approach them in entirely different ways. Putting a hanger on the door or sending out an email or a letter I don't think works. And there's some really successful business models out there in other verticals that I think we can look at.
Blair, what's happening in Electra? What are you doing to really make sure you truly understand what your customers want and need?
Well, just to build on what David said, the customer experience issue is a big one for all utilities, and it's one that many utilities are slow compared to other industries in getting off the mark. But so we're undertaking a large customer experience renewal and program. It really is focusing on a unified platform. In other words, so that the customer and the CSR presentation, when they're speaking to each other, is the same and identical branding across all the layers. But what the customer is seeing is what the CSR is seeing, and so they're having the same experience. Omni-channel, so that and speaking to what David said about generations, making sure that customers can engage with the company through whatever channel they like, and that it's a consistent, integrated presentation to them, and our CSRs can deal with them that way. And the third one is really self-service, and empowering them to fully complete their interactions how and when they want. And that sounds straightforward, but especially given the types of customer experience that we enjoy today through many other industries. But putting in the back IT systems now, and also the training of employees so that they can understand and work to help the customer. And one final point, we talked about value proposition. I think the way we're approaching it is what does the customer value? And this speaks to what was said earlier as well. What does the customer value rather than what does Electra value? And once we zero in with that mindset, I think we're a long way towards improving the customer experience and enabling the new types of energy world that's awaiting out there, and being a trusted advisor to them by being able to talk their language through channels that they want to interact with us on.
Great.
All great points from David, Blair, I think. And I go back to the previous session before ours, the topic about educating the customer. I think what's more important is educating ourselves about the customer than educating the customer about ourselves. That to me is the key. And I have a story, actually. I'm not the first person in this story, but it was explained to me by one of my former managers at Engie. I think it's fair to share. It's basically, it was a grocery store that they were trying to pitch a certain solution as an energy company, and they did everything right. They picked the right people in the room, all the C-level executives. They did a great presentation about their company, about how well they could do demand response, and so on and so forth. And the response from the customer, from the grocery stores, that's all great, but we don't understand anything you're saying. All we care about is selling lettuce, and we need to make sure the light shines on the right way on our lettuce. It's fresh so that the customers can take it. So if you do this response, maybe it's not going to work as well for us. So they couldn't get the deal, and I think that was like an alarm clock for the organization. Okay, we need to really stop talking about us and start listening. And that will ultimately yield to the first point, which is customer segmentation. You're going to end up with so many segments, and eventually you're going to figure out that every customer is basically different.
Yeah, great. So clearly changing within the industry, changing our own mindset is one of the first things that has to happen to really be able to put customers at the center of the business. What are some of the other things that have to happen? What are some of the barriers that this industry faces whether they be existing regulatory constructs or the way the utility, has operated for 100 years that needs to change? What are some of those things that are really holding us back from being able to put the customer front and center?
Well,
yeah, I mean, I'll
Go ahead,
by all means.
Well, I was going to,
okay.
I would just say that it really is the intersection between the traditional utility roles and the changing needs of consumers is a problem for regulators and utilities. And addressing that, and that speaks to working with regulators, and what's happening in Vermont is it sounds like they're addressing that. But that is something that needs to be, and everybody's working on. The other thing would be that, again, the capital cost, and this is changing, but the capital cost of new technologies versus the traditional costs of grid power. Now, that grid power rates and the costs of these new technologies is coming down, and the grid power rates are going up. So that problem, I think, will solve itself in the next couple of years. But it has been a problem, and given what's happening with the economy now, given the pandemics, I think that capital will be a problem probably for the next 18 months, maybe longer.
On that point, let me actually tie back. David, you mentioned early on in your comments about Unbill Financing as one of the innovations that you see, and I think that goes directly to Blair's point about the capital needs. Why do you think it is we haven't seen more utility programs for Unbill Financing? Do you think that's a trend that's coming, or is there something that's keeping that from becoming commonplace, more commonplace?
It's a really good question. I'd like to think that it's something that will come more and more. It's kind of funny if you think about the utilities. Once upon a time had these appliance stores, right? And they would sell, white goods because, of course, those are electric consuming appliances, and that was all good, right? I think the utilities, again, can be in the middle of making this happen. And I think about the utilities and energy providers as being really important here, because if you want something to happen at scale, we want something to happen, writ large, the utilities are in a position to be able to do that, especially if they can offer things like bill financing to get over the upfront costs. I mean, I thought for a while, why wouldn't we do that with electric vehicles? I think the barrier to electric vehicle adoption, for example, is not about charging infrastructure. I think it's a contributor, but I think the real issue is households saying, we could buy this crossover gas-fired vehicle at X price, or is there an electric vehicle equivalent, or if there is, it's going to be a little bit more expensive, at least up front. So I'd like to think there'll be more and more attention to this. I like being a part of the program that's being developed in Long Island, because we'll learn from that, and we'll learn from the experience. I'm just going to add one other sort of observation in general in terms of barrier. I think the more that utility business model is structured around customer outcomes and solutions, meaning, are there ways in which we can reward utilities for delivering on that sort of capability and that sort of result? Can regular performance-based sort of incentives be structured that way? That's a personal curiosity of mine. We talked about in a recent paper with EEI. I think people do things based on what they're motivated to do, or what their business proposition is. So I think we maybe need to keep thinking about how the regulatory model encourages to be moving in the customer direction.
Yeah, and that actually ties right into a question that we have here in the chat about, do regulators really care about customer engagement and experience, or do they only care about reliability and cost? And this is something we talk about a lot within SEPA. Regulatory innovation is one of the 4 focus areas for our organization, and the increasing complexity of objectives that regulators have to deal with these days, right? In the early days, they were economic regulators. That was all they were there to do, was to make sure that there were fair and reasonable rates. But now they have so many things they're trying to accomplish. Any thoughts on, sort of additional thoughts on the evolution of regulators, and to the audience question of, do they really care about customer engagement and experience?
I think do you want to go first? I mean, that's fine.
No, by all means.
Um, I was just going to say, I think they should care. There are some, I think, that are going towards that direction. And maybe I can link the answer to that question to one of the other barriers that I was going to mention, which is data. The link between the kilowatt hour and customer wanted outcome is a kilobyte. We need to use data to be able to convert our intrinsic product to whatever the customer wants. And unfortunately, and we talked about this, I think it was more than a year ago with Erin on one of the podcasts with Z Prime. We talked about how our industry was so bad in terms of providing customer data, consumption data, and not being able to standardize it across different states and things like that. Over the past year, I don't think we're in any better shape because we didn't get enough traction on this, unfortunately. While we can see some of the other industries, like the financial industry, really figuring this out in a very efficient way. So I think, for example, it's still baffling to me in this day and age, we don't have a standardized nationwide data clearinghouse for, let's say, consumption data. As a consumer, you can go to any store you want, and if you want to buy a TV, let's say, you can punch in your social in the checkout queue, and your financial data, your financial history, will flow in the back end to that store's information system, and they can within seconds make a decision whether to loan you money for you to be able to buy a TV or not. For us to do the same thing in the energy space, we have to wait days, weeks in some cases, to be able to get a customer data so that we can offer a customized solution for the customer. And that is really decades apart between the financial industry and the utility industry, unfortunately. Yes, there are, of course, things like privacy and cybersecurity that are important, but to deliver the outcome, I think we have to do a much better job in terms of basically sharing data across our businesses. And to link that to the question that was asked, I think the regulation in some states at least are taking the right steps for making that happen. I see things that are happening in New Hampshire, for instance. They're trying to build a centralized statewide data repository. Similar things happening in DC. Texas have revamped their Smart Meter Texas portal. So all those things, I think, show, at least on the data front, the regulators are taking some steps. Unfortunately, it's not common everywhere in the nation. So that's, of course, that's room to improve. But I think there is some steps being taken that I think we need to be happy about.
Blair, how are you thinking about data and new skill sets that are needed within the utility in this world of?
The data issue is one that we are focusing on and addressing as part of the senior management team. But just going back to the earlier question about the regulation, I think the regulators are focused on reliability and cost, but what's happening as larger customers, in particular large commercial customers, start to install distributed energy resources and other technologies behind the meter, it is disrupting the traditional utility model and therefore the regulatory model. So the status quo isn't an option just from a business standpoint, stranded assets standpoint. So as I said earlier, when we started, was the loads disappearing, it's not coming back. Therefore, the traditional utility models are being undermined. And I think the regulators realize this. They're hearing it in their regulatory hearings and applications from utilities. And so that will drive change. And the change, again, will start to probably focus on this intersection between the traditional utility role and the new customer needs and technologies that they themselves are installing.
Yeah, and to that point, we talked a little bit when we were having our pre-call about sort of the need for partnerships, right? Utilities can't do this on their own, and it's going to be increasingly important for utilities to recognize where their strengths are and where the strengths are of potential partners that they can bring in, and working with companies like Engie and others, really can bring the highest value and return to the customers. Any interesting examples to share where you've seen innovative partnerships between utilities and technology companies that really have benefited customers in a way that others should think about replicating?
Well, I'll go back and use the example that I provided at the outset in terms of a partnership example. You know, I think utilities have really done a great job in a variety of cases is reach that very conclusion you just described, which is, you know, we're not best doing this ourselves. We're best like tapping a technology or an approach or a mindset that comes from a third party. So in the case of my own utility, you know, so they have a long-standing partnership with Tesla, and that's led to a whole bunch of solutions that customers have, like myself, who simply said, I don't want to own a generator in Vermont in the winter, and I want to have a battery that will provide me resiliency and reliability. So that's great. But there's multiple other examples. I think this all gets interesting if you think about the utility business model just in a different way, is it's this platform sort of environment where at a base layer, you've got AMI and the data we've been talking about, and you find ways to leverage and share that data. And then there's a whole set of solutions that can come on top of that. I mean, the Bidgeleys of the world that offer, you know, data disaggregation that provides all types of great insight to customers. You know, to the technology players that, you know, are either home technologies, you know, smart home sort of things, on up to electric vehicles. I think there's a lot of opportunity here to partner and not think about this thing in terms of silos. And I think, you know, to the regulatory question, yeah, we absolutely need to think differently about how we incentivize or motivate or reward utilities for moving in this direction, as opposed to historically, okay, let's pay attention to safety and Katie, not trying to, you know, minimize that importance, but, you know, there's a value added path here, I think, beyond just the electrons that we can pursue.
Yeah, I think, and maybe you can even list this as a barrier. I agree. The culture, whether it's protectionism or is it the belief that as a utility we have to be the best in everything, that I think has to go away. It doesn't matter how big or how sophisticated you are. I mean, you can take any example you want. Load forecasting, I don't know. It doesn't matter if you're the one that invests the most amount of money in load forecasting. It doesn't matter if you bring the best talent in the industry for building the best load forecasting solution. There are going to be two guys in their garage doing something and coming up with a solution that's going to be better than what you do. So it doesn't matter. We shouldn't focus too much on these capabilities that are not strategic to our business. Instead, we need to focus on how we're going to bring these capabilities together. How can we build a platform, like it was said, where you can be modular and flexible enough so that you can bring these different solutions together and offer the customer the right ingredients, basically. Or how do you get the ingredients from these solutions and offer the best meal to the customer? You should invest, where you should spend your time and resources on are how you should be engaging the customer. How can we educate our own employees? How can we change our culture so that we can engage the customer the right way? And I do agree the existing rent-seeking utility business model is not the right model for doing this. It's not easy to change that, of course. It will time, it will take regulatory intervention, it will take a lot of things, but it has to happen if we want to transition from the traditional model to a service-based business model that takes the customer in the middle.
Yeah, I don't remember which one of you mentioned this in your introductory remarks, but one of you used the phrase rapid prototyping, right? And that's just not the way the utility industry has operated in the past. So, what are some of the things that need to happen? I mean, obviously there's a cultural component, there's the regulatory component, but what else needs to happen to allow utilities to truly be able to innovate in a rapid prototyping type approach?
Well, it's a culture thing, isn't it? I mean, I think that's where we're just going. Making these types of change in human behavior are not easy. And I want to be very fair to utilities. I mean, you have to pay attention to what they've historically been asked to do. How are they actually rewarded today? And what are the motivations to move in a different direction? And there's plenty of good examples of utilities moving in this direction. I just think that, this won't happen right away. But I think a lot of it is around these kinds of changes are a function of mindset, right? So we have to change how we think about how we interact with customers, change the way we operate day to day, change to think about how we're going to prosper in the long run. Those are the things. I think the regulatory process is a huge part of it. If we could possibly, take some looks there. How do we incentivize the behavior we want?
The other thing too, I mean, there's probably at least two ways to grow your utility business. One is acquire other utilities and stay in the wires business and just get bigger. And that is a business model that many utilities are following. And it's logical that they would do that, I suppose, in the short or medium term. We've looked at that and realized, given what we've just talked about for the last 30 minutes, our customers are driving the change. So when we've got large industrial customers in our service territory, they don't need Electra if they install behind the meter technologies today. They can displace a lot of load at a very competitive price. So our approach has been, okay, well, let's get part of that business. Let's find partners who are working with those technologies and see if Electra can offset the traditional loss of traditional business by growing its commercial interests and its involvement in these new technologies.
Great. So we've only got 5 minutes left in our session, and I want to make sure that we dedicate some time to talk about how do we make sure that, in particular, underrepresented and disadvantaged communities are front and center, and that they are not only not being harmed by the energy transition, but in fact are benefiting from it.
Yeah, by all means, go ahead.
I have a thought on that. I've been thinking about it a lot. The smart cities movement, I think, probably has a clue. As more and more cities start to embrace new technologies and smart technologies themselves, there is a logical role for this industry to play in that. And I was reading something that Electra has been working on, and it has to do with local food, access to food, and where these types of technologies we've been talking about could be applied to greenhouses or local growing farms to increase the efficiency of those types of operations, for example, to the benefit of the community, specifically in the area of access to food. Obviously, we're in the very early days of this, but it seems to me that may be an area where utilities can start to play a role, generally in the smart cities evolution.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think this question about access to clean energy solutions for all economic segments has always been a concern of mine. And, maybe coming out of being a regulator, you think about these things. And, I used to always worry about it becoming the gated community grid, where, it's the kind of grid set of solutions that the people who have the means can have. And we don't want that to happen, I don't think. And where I kind of would go back to say, the utility role being in the center, there are cases we probably should be thinking about why can't the utility be in a certain space when it comes to DER solutions if they're going to make sure that everyone has access to it, if they can potentially bring the cost of that down. If the goal is having more people having access to clean energy and decarbonizing, for example, you know, we shouldn't be black and white about who plays in that DER space.
I think it also goes back to culture. You know, we have to. I think we do have a culture in our organization. But every decision we make, we have to take into account the well-being of our people, our employees. That's one thing, of course, but also the impact on society as a whole. And it's a very wide spectrum. It might take different shapes and forms. You know, it might mean everything from just health and safety to equity in gender or underrepresented communities for both the management of our own organization, but also how these communities benefit from our work as well. And it's funny. I mean, that goes back to customer engagement discussion probably we had in the beginning. That conversation is not limited to energy. And I want to highlight it again. It's about defining the job to be done. It's not about educating them about us. It's about educating us them. If we can figure it out, it won't take long to understand how important it is for us to invest not just on infrastructure, but how to invest in a roster of different organizations, NGOs. How can we specialize in education, environment, you know, children's health? How can we give out scholarships, commit to good, you know, transparent relationships with our stakeholders? It's very important, and it's that balance between what at Engie we define as our strategy, which is the 3 Ps. It used to be 3 Ds, now it's 3 P: people, planet, and profit. That balance between all three, if we can management, it's not only important for social benefit, it has to be the reason for our success. So I think it's very important, and there's many ways to get it done.
Well, that was well said, and I think is a fantastic note to end on. Thank you all so much for a really interesting and insightful discussion. Thanks for all the work that you're doing in the industry to move things forward. And with that, I will hand it back over to Aaron.